Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our show notes and pictures of our lovely guests over on the podcast page. It's great to have you here, listeners. Let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to episode 280 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, which today is dedicated to being mindful and deliberate about how we start to use the office as a team. So yes, we are still talking about adopting a hybrid way of working, using both the office and other work locations, other kind of remote work, whether it's working from home or a co-working space or wherever. And to give us an inside view of what's going on in a global corporation, we've got returning guest Justin Morris. And the last time I recorded with Justin, he was working for a company helping people adopt Microsoft 365. And in particular, he was helping, if I remember correctly, people adopt Microsoft Teams. And since then, which was 2019, he's moved jobs and he now works directly for Microsoft. He's now an employee there. And during our conversation, he talks about how that corporation is approaching the hybrid way of working as well. So what's really interesting is that because Justin joined Microsoft during the pandemic, he also shares a little bit about his experience of doing that, of joining a company like many people have actually during the pandemic and having to do all the onboarding and figuring it all out and meeting new people all online. So he just talks a little bit about that. And also he talks about how they're starting to use the offices again and the way in which Microsoft is managing that. And that is at the time of recording in July 2021. He mentions, and I think this is really interesting, have I come across this phrase before? Probably. But he mentions reopening anxiety for some people who are going back to the office. And this is really a reminder that the plans for hybrid work this year, 2021, need to be different to the long-term plans. I'm starting to sound a bit like a broken record around this one, but we really are dealing right now with two issues, which is starting to use the office again while there are still restrictions, while the pandemic is pretty much still going on. And then what's going to happen after that, hopefully within, I don't know, your guess is as good as mine, a year, 2 years, who knows. But we really need to look at how that is different in the same way as the time during our pandemic and the remote work we had during the pandemic is going to look very different to the remote work we had in a couple of years' time. So I think this is really, really, really important because we're going to be dealing with lots of issues like people being anxious about returning to the office and especially having to use public transport to do that, to actually on the other end of this spectrum, the residues of the lockdown where people are desperate to go back to the office in a way we haven't seen before. And again, I imagine that will be a short-term thing, this desperation to be together. Something else will happen later. Haven't got a clue, and it will be so different. So if you are thinking about planning how to do this, if you're thinking about managing the reopening of the offices in your company, choices, etc., be very mindful of this. We are really talking about two very separate stages. So we don't go into any detail about that, by the way, in the conversation. These are just my reflections. But Justin also talks about the need to make hybrid work inclusive and how we can use technology to help us with that. So all in all, I thought it was really interesting. Well, it's a great way to catch up with people, the podcast. By the way, if we haven't met before, my name is Pilar Orti, and regular listeners might notice, you might not, that I've got a little bit of a cold, and I am completely baffled by this because I have been so careful obviously not to contract the COVID, but So I don't know how I've got this cold, but anyway, hey ho. So my name is Pilar Ortiz. We haven't met before, and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, and we have loads of information there on leading and managing remote teams. We also have the show notes, which are summaries of our episodes, and they are great. And especially I recommend that you share them with people who don't listen to podcasts, but our show notes, they're such a great summary, and I know that they are the favorite bit for some of our listeners, including Catherine, who was also a guest on the show. So we help people transition to an office optional approach, but that is also changing because our company is changing due to the changes in the world of work. So we're now really championing the use of audio to help people in organizations stay together. So check out Podcasting for Connection, our new service. So right after the conversation with Justin, I'll be back with a little bit more material about online teamwork. But for now, let's join Justin as he tells us his experience of starting a new job during the pandemic.
Yeah, I joined in January of this year, so really at the height of the third lockdown here in the UK, and it was definitely an interesting experience. I think traditional way of joining a new organisation is that first day in the office, and you meet a lot of people, and you start to really absorb the culture and go have coffee or lunch with the new boss, and it was extremely different to that. Really, I finished up at my last company the week before, and then came back in to work at the same desk in front of the same screen, but with a completely different company. And so the remote onboarding into Microsoft was handled really well, and people were incredibly proactive and inclusive with making me feel welcome, because you don't get that chance to really wander the floors and run into people on the fly. So you need to just be a lot more proactive with that, of which people have been, and the onboarding process from a HR point of view had to be a lot more immersive and engaging than what probably a lot of organizations have previously. And I've come into Microsoft in a bit of a new role that has been formed within our customer success organization, to really help organizations look at how they can modernize the way that they communicate and collaborate, and look at how they adapt to this sort of new world of work that we have, and how they can look at the way how they're having meetings, and not necessarily from a concept of how we have more meetings, because I think everybody has really been immersed in that since we all started working from home at the start of the pandemic, but actually just being more intelligent and mindful around when we have a meeting and why we have a meeting, and then looking at all the things that sit all around that, around things like having the right devices and when to use things like calling as well.
Yeah. And of course, as well as having meetings, it's a whole new way of working. And something that Microsoft has is this whole ecosystem of tools that can be used for asynchronous communication, so that so that meetings become one more tool in which to collaborate and converse, rather than the one, which has been the experience with a lot of people during the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. And it's striking a balance across those spectrum of tools that are available, because everybody works in different ways. And I think we've all benefited from working from home, transformation that's occurred in terms of having more time to spend with family and things like that. And so that we do have a bit more flexibility now to catch up on some work after dinner, maybe once the kids are down and you haven't started watching Netflix yet, and having a bit more of an asynchronous look at things. And so it's not just 9 till 5 through the day in meetings, and just having a bit more of a trusted way of looking how we get work done.
Mhm. And you were saying, so you've been 6 months in your new job, and mostly you've had contact with other people online. Are you starting to use the office, or at least are you starting to use some offices?
We are, yeah. So at Microsoft, we have a dial of how we look at how the offices are open. So it goes from stage one, where everyone is remote, nobody can be on site at all, completely closed, through to stage 6, where the offices are open, everybody's welcome on site, all of the services are available. So as the UK has unlocked, the Microsoft offices in the UK have slowly moved through the dials as well, now to the point where we're at I think about a stage 3 or stage 4 now. So in the last month, we've been able to revisit the offices and start to set up some lunches or in-person meetings and workshops. And we're also starting to look at how we have an inclusive and hybrid work style through this, because some people are really keen to go back to the office and to have a bit of that vibe and what comes from being around people, and others aren't quite ready for that yet. I think there is something called reopening anxiety, so people are really mindful of that, and it's how we kind of bring everybody along on that journey. But it's definitely been good to actually experience working at Microsoft and in a Microsoft office, and using my badge to actually enter the office for the first time.
Yeah, that's great. Those 6 stages. It reminds me, of course, of many countries have this, but in the UK, the tier system. So when we were into lockdown, out of lockdown, a little bit restrictions, local restrictions, because it really gives, in my mind, if you have stages 1 to 6 of going into the office, it gives me a mindset of this is a transition. There are different, it will look different at each stage. We're not back to normal or we're not back to the office. Each stage will have its pace, and at each stage, like you say, some people will be happy going back, others not. I really like that approach.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's the locations can go back and forward on the dial. So, as an example, some of the Australian offices were the first to reach stage 3 and 4 and 5. But just recently in the Sydney, Brisbane, and other offices there, they've had some Delta variant flares up, and so they've now gone back to stage 2. And so it's given us this very kind of flexible approach to how we address all the offices based on the local COVID status.
I have 2 questions. One is around what you're talking about, which is how do we, how are you, or how do you think you will navigate that, this constant which will last for a small while, hopefully, of offices opening, closing, office closing, and so having to adjust to that. How do you find that, and what are your thoughts around that? Because as a person who can go into the office maybe for a couple of weeks and then things change, so we have to maybe go back to working from home. How do you navigate that?
One thing that we as Microsoft realized early was that the one size will not fit all for all of this, and having like a set structure is not going to cut it, as things are so fluid, and as we kind of work through this all across the globe and locally as well. And it needs to be like a real clear strategy that's adaptable to cater for the variety of individual and organizational needs that we've discussed that are kind of found inside UK workplaces. But it is an opportunity to kind of really reshape work around individual roles, preferences, and even people's personal lives. So it enables workers to really better serve the collective goals of the organisation. And what we've really realised is that leaders need to embrace extreme flexibility in when, where, and how people work. And it's all going to be about looking at having a framework for this as we move forward, because what we've understood from some of our research is that there's a bit of a paradox with hybrid right now, where 71% of people want flexible remote options to stay, but 62% of people want more in-person work or collaboration post-pandemic. So how do you reconcile the two of those? And so there's a balance to be struck, obviously, and ultimately it's all going to be about flexibility and having a framework that allows you to think of it in three key ways. So looking at the people elements of hybrid work, the place aspect, and then the processes, and having the right policies to enable hybrid work, and having the right leadership and cultural perspectives and mindset around that, and then having the right technology to underpin those 3 pillars that provides a secure experience. It's incredibly inclusive to everybody that needs to use it, and that it's cloud powered, so it's agile and it's very fast to spin up and use. And then ultimately, it's all about experimenting with this entire framework, because we're learning as we go, and so there'll be some changes required depending on how those things perform and how they work for people. So that really gives us a bit of a kind of guiding light of how we're approaching producing hybrid work.
So let me just pull right back to something you were saying, which is about people wanting flexibility and individual preferences. And then if you want to refer to the framework, to how you're looking at it, how do you reconcile the fact that we have individual preferences, but then we have got teams and an organization? And this is a conversation that I've had recently with a few people, and I'd like to shout out to a listener, Igor, with whom I had a conversation about this recently, which is this tension between what the individual wants and needs and the fact that actually we're working in a collaborative environment. What are some of your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think it's about not making assumptions about how people want to work and being very inclusive and proactive with communicating with people. As an example, we have a planning workshop set up in our Paddington offices for a couple of weeks from now, which is an all-day workshop, and then some people will attend in person there. But we're going to lengths to ensure that people that join from right across the UK can be fully included. And as we start to kind of move through this rhythm of new working, that we take time to bring those folks that aren't in the room on to make them feel included. So doing things like keeping track of the meeting chat that occurs during a meeting, or making sure that we're working out loud, which I know is a real favorite of yours, Pilar, and that using Teams and the channels that are available there, so that work doesn't happen in silos or in pockets, or just kind of keep in people's minds or files in their OneDrive.
So going back to your framework of people, place, and processes, I think it was, with the technology and the cloud-based supporting it. I'm thinking of inclusivity, because one of my fears is that we focus how to make meetings inclusive. So we do all the things that you're saying. If we are having hybrid meetings, that neither the people in the physical co-located space nor the people in the remote space feel excluded, because it could go both ways. So we've got that. There's a lot of focus on making meetings inclusive, but how do we make the work inclusive by using the technology, and what kind of processes? And of course, I'm talking about the work that is not happening in real time, all the asynchronous work around it.
We can definitely share some of our experiences and experimentation of this. It's been really around making sure, as we work out loud and in Teams channels in the asynchronous mode, is that we're using very clear headings in the communications that we put into those channels. So if it's about a new document or a client or an event or something, making the headings really clear so it's easy for people to read, and then mentioning the right people or groups or tags of people that this would be relevant for, and making it clear that, hey, I'd like some input on this or some feedback, or could you please complete these sections, and making it clear that this is not a document and then we set up a meeting to talk about the document. It's the document, and the asynchronous work lives within that channel, and the expectation is it should evolve, and people should input, obviously in their own time, but it should grow, and the work should get done in an asynchronous manner. And this is really important as we start to look at hybrid work and the meeting that occurs in a synchronous point of view, but also how we can continue to take what happens before a meeting or an event and what happens after as well. And we are launching a new feature called Fluid Components, where you'll be able to create little kind of artifacts or snippets of creativity, like a list or a table, like a list of actions or something, and you could create that in a Teams chat, and then you could take it and then put it into an Outlook meeting, or you could take it and put it into a OneNote, and then everybody could continue to collaborate and evolve that table or that list, and you could bring it into the meeting, continue to refer to it, and then continue to work asynchronously on it afterwards as well, so that you've sort of always got this continuum of content that follows through in the work that's happening. And we look at it from a really broad communications life cycle of things happen at work, from the spark of an idea, and then things happen like meetings and documents and conversations, all the way through to an outcome, like something was produced and it was put in front of a client, or it went out to market, or it went in front of an executive leader or something like that. And it's just thinking broadly across how we can use all the tools in a synchronous and asynchronous manner.
Excellent. So I really like that. So fluid components. So it's the idea that we start to see work not as a series of starts and stops. So now I'm doing this and I'm doing it in this way and now that, but actually I get and I work, to take your example, I work on a table and we work on that asynchronously by maybe adding ideas or giving feedback. And then that in some way, when you then schedule a meeting, it goes into the meeting invite. Is that what you're saying? And then we can just carry on and take it. So as you say, it becomes fluid, and the work, that's the key of hybrid, isn't it? To use the technology and of course the people and the place, whether the place is online and which place online and the same co-located. We use both spaces, but we start to be able to go and move seamlessly between them.
Yeah, that's definitely the vision that we're working towards, and we're making investments in innovation on the meeting side of things so that people can continue to have a really inclusive and equitable experience. But we know that like the aim is not to keep people in meetings, because fatigue is real in those, right? And so it is about how we can innovate on other parts of the platform to make it easier for people to keep the flow of work happening, but in more of an asynchronous way that kind of just allows them to still utilize the benefits that we've experienced from flexible work and all kind of not being in the office as much.
And in a way, the examples you were giving us about having the way that the channels are named, right, to tagging people when necessary, all those things, they're also about this mindset, which is key and has always been key in distributed organizations, to be very deliberate and structured in the work. Something which, if you have always worked in an office, you might not have thought of so much structuring. And for some people, it might feel like too much. But I think it's going to take even more structure now to incorporate now the two locations, different ways of working. It's very interesting.
It is, yeah, and that's really at the heart of kind of mindful teamwork thing that I was talking about, is because there's a risk that as we go back to the office, we just fall back into that sort of presenteeism of, oh, there's a expectation that for me to get the most work done and get visibility of leaders and the most sort of professional development opportunities, that I need to be there in the office. So I need to be included in some of those conversations, that when a spark of an idea happens, somebody walks over to a desk and says, hey, what about this? Oh, that's a good idea. And then things snowball outside of the full group of people that need to have some inclusion in the development of that idea, and things start to diverge. And so what we are doing at Microsoft is having a bit of a sense check and say, actually, let's stop and think about, let's take this conversation and put it as an announcement in the right Teams channel, so we can get all those perspectives of people that would have value in moving this idea forward and getting it in the right place, so that we can make sure that everybody comes on the journey with us, and we don't fall back into that kind of traditional way of people being in the same place together. We can fully embrace everything that we've had the benefits from over the last 18 months.
Can you tell me more about mindful teamwork? It strikes me that it starts with a huge degree of self-awareness.
Yeah, it does, and it's something that I just coined randomly as we were putting together a perspective on combating meeting fatigue as part of my team. We were producing a bit of a point of view on that, and we started looking right across the spectrum of the communications life cycle. So where you do have meetings peppered through that, but what happens at the start of the spark of the idea right through to the production of the output at the end, and thinking that this spark of the idea of who could I involve here to get some input and weigh in on, is this the right direction that we're going, canvassing different resources and different points of view on things as that thing starts to grow, and getting the right team involved. And we have in Microsoft a bit of a culture of building on top of the work of others, and then helping others be successful as well in the work that you do. And so that all kind of comes into the team that you form around what you're trying to achieve, so that you can all kind of push together, and you're creating kind of value for the customer, but also value for each other as you work through it all. And then you think about all of the tools within the Microsoft 365 toolkit of okay, I'll start within Microsoft Teams, but then I might want to utilize something like a shared OneNote so we can all start to pile in with our ideas in there. And then we might use Microsoft Whiteboard to do some inking and utilize some of the pen features to actually diagram, because I think we've all been in working environments before where you'd be talking with people and you're starting to try to visualize in your head and vocalize it. And then you go, well, let's just get on the whiteboard, and you start drawing out a diagram or a process or something. And so using the tools for that and making sure that you can take that asset you created and bring it forward into a meeting that you might have, because ultimately as a project or a sales campaign or anything that you're working on, there's generally some motion required with that. So you might have like a weekly project check-in or progress or something like that. And so being able to bring all those assets with you, and they're all in the one place, they're always referenceable, they're always live and fresh and dynamic because they're powered by the cloud, is just sort of thinking about, am I pulling the right tool out to use this, and being mindful of the technology, but also the people and the processes, so that it ultimately creates the best outcome for everyone.
So I'm going back at something that you've reminded me of when you were talking about, okay, this is all about being mindful about basically how you develop an idea with all the stages and all the steps that you mentioned. And some time ago, I came across a blog post from the company Parable. They're a tech company, and they described their decision-making process and how they did that in an async way in their collaboration tool. And when I talk to managers about doing this, it really strikes me that for the decisions that are not urgent, so basically when we're talking about really cool decision making, which is about the development of an idea and all the decisions that go around that, it really forces us also to slow down, because you start to realize, like you said, there's, okay, this first the idea, how do I communicate that? What's the best way? Who do I want to bring in? And then what will the process of collaboration look like? It's a real opportunity to slow down. That's really nice.
It is something that we owe ourselves as part of this, is to have a bit of an inflection point and awareness to say, do I have the right people involved before you run off in one direction? And I've been guilty of this before in my career, where I'll run off and create a 20 slide PowerPoint deck about something that I think is a fantastic idea. And then when I launch it, I wonder why I hear nothing, because nobody's had been included as part of that creation process, and I haven't had those perspectives and thought of everybody's opinions and viewpoints on things. And so I think that's really critical, and ultimately it creates like a better performance and an outcome for the organization, because you're kind of canvassing all the diverse perspectives that you could possibly offer, and then you're using the right tools that the organization has available to them, so that you kind of look at something that's then go, okay, we've got it in a state where it's ready to use, and then you've also not got sort of challenges around versioning and the like.
And also in slowing down and taking all these steps, we avoid the danger of all this great technology, which is also another thing that worries me. And it's that we just use the technology to continue with that very fast-paced, you refer to presentism, that assuming that everyone is available all the time, so that I go suddenly from an idea right to plan of implementation within 24 hours, because everyone is on Teams all the time, everyone's answering, everyone's got everything open. So I think that a key of making, and going back to your mindfulness of helping technology to help us work better, which is what we want, is to really pull back and say, okay, we do need more time. And part of inclusiveness, I imagine, Justin, is to allow people to contribute in a time that suits them better. And of course, going back to, we need to be coordinating with the team and all of that. But I think, is there something around that as well, finding the time and giving people the time to contribute when they're at their best?
There definitely is. Like as an example, like I pick up my 2-year-old son from nursery some days of the week between 3 and 4, so I'm unavailable to attend meetings at that time, but I make sure that I catch up on what's happened and then respond, after dinner or something on those days, and making it really setting clear expectations with the people that you're working with around your availability, but then also what the requirements are in terms of timeframes. If you're working on an urgent deliverable like responding to an RFP as an example, there's a deadline with that. And so making it clear to people that, hey, I do need your input, or I need you to review or produce that diagram or slide or paragraph of text into that by this date so that we can meet the deadline. And as long as people are aware, then it doesn't matter if they get it done at 9 o'clock in the morning or at 8 o'clock at night, as long as it's done by the deadline and people are aware of where those tools and resources and assets live, so they can go in and make their inputs.
Great. So is there anything else around mindful teamwork that we haven't touched upon, Justin?
I think from a process point of view, it's going to really about offering people the level of autonomy that they need as part of this, and then kind of really embedding like a continuous sort of testing and experimentation approach and learning as we go along through this. So I think it's a personal thing, but also a collective thing that we need to sort of take into consideration through this, and being mindful to think about what worked last time or what didn't work, and actually kind of adapting and learning and making changes is really at the heart of all of that.
That is very difficult for some organizations where we have been working in the same way and following the same kind of processes for a very long time, is that culture of experimentation that you referred also underpins your framework. Is there anything that you could say to people who are not used to working in that way, or to managers who are finding themselves having to experiment with their teams, but they're not quite sure how because it's something maybe they haven't done in a very long time?
It is challenging. Yeah, I fully understand and respect that. And that's why leadership and culture is really at the heart of our perspective on the hybrid work movement. And so, like, having a conversation with yourselves is to say, like, we are going to continue to experiment. And I think at least we have got some time to slow down and plan this now as we start to unlock and return to offices and define a new way of working, as opposed to when the UK went into lockdown and we just had to react and all go home and start working, and just sort of, it's almost, we tried to recreate what happened in the office in an online sense, and that had varying degrees of outcome to it. And so now we've got this chance to say, let's rethink and look at how we work and how we can make that more flexible and equitable for people going forward. And that goes from everything from the processes of how organizations get work done all the way through to how their physical spaces are changed. Like, we have customers and Microsoft itself where we're actually looking at, well, do we need all these walls in these offices, and how are we going to reframe meeting rooms so that there's more, rather than everybody sitting around a table, there's one wall of the room has a screen on it, and only one side of the table has chairs. And so you can then start to have like a true hybrid experience for people in the room and also online. And it's just sort of taking the time to rethink all those things so that you can provide a fully inclusive experience as people go from being in the office to online, and what's comfortable for them.
Well, listeners, I hope you enjoyed that and that it gave you plenty to think about. It's definitely made me think about a lot of stuff I hadn't before. And one of them is, as we were saying near the end of the conversation, that in having to adopt remote work during a pandemic and during a crisis, we probably haven't had the chance to really think about how we want to work. And now going back to the office, and now starting to use the offices again, gives us that opportunity, but we might find that we have to change, or maybe not change, but definitely address what our own ways of working are like and what they are conducive to us doing. And then seeing whether there are certain shifts that we need to make in order to make the office optional approach or the hybrid approach work, because it is very complex, it's very complicated. And as Justin was saying, right at the beginning of the conversation, when he was talking about the 6 stages that Microsoft is implementing in going back to the office, how you can dial between one was being everyone working from home, all offices shut, right to 6, where offices can welcome everybody. Even that is going to take so much thought, and even each stage might require us to work slightly differently. So plenty to think about. So thank you very much, Justin, for coming back to the show. And as a reminder, listeners, if you want to connect with Justin, his name is Justin Morris. Find him on LinkedIn, also on Twitter, actually, which is where I met him. And if you want to hear him talking about using video in meetings, so on online meetings, then check out the episode from the 7th of June of 2019, which was a Fickle Friday episode. And it didn't have a number because I didn't used to number bonus episodes until I went mad and included them in the schedule. So if you look for Fickle Friday with Justin Morris, 7th of June 2019, you can find him there. And I just want to spend 5 more minutes with you, if I may, having talked about mindful teamwork with Justin. I thought I'd take this opportunity to remind you, if you're a regular listener, and if you're a new listener, maybe to introduce you to the concept of visible teamwork, which is something I started to develop a few years ago. And when I say develop, it's not a practice that I've invented. It's just a name of some concepts. And it's become the main topic of the training sessions that I've been doing with managers. This was the topic already before the pandemic, but now I think it's even more important to introduce more people to this concept of, as Justin was saying, working out loud. But again, I renamed it because working out loud has the word loud in it. This is more about making the teamwork visible in different ways. And it really is a set of principles that underpin practices I've seen in distributed companies. So mainly in organizations that were set up to be remote. Therefore, they have thought about, evolved, experimented with ways of working that work best in that space. That sometimes they might have been trying to replicate something that they had experienced before when they were working in the office. But these practices come not from, we used to do this, how do we do that online, but from what works best here in this context, which is online. So it really is just a set of principles that I've seen reflected in different ways. And I am a little bit afraid that with all the focus on hybrid, the focus is going on location. So are we in the office? How many days in the office are we? And also, as I was saying in the conversation with Justin, that I see a lot of information and conversations which are about hybrid meetings, as if that's going to be the main way of collaborating in the new way of working. Whereas, of course, we've got asynchronous communication as part of that collaboration. So if you've already heard loads about visible teamwork, then thank you for listening. You probably don't want to hear it again. But if you're new to this, I just want to introduce you to what I've named the 3 buckets or areas of visible teamwork. And these are deliberate communication, work visibility, and planned spontaneity. So deliberate communication is all about having processes, so things that we do, that we've talked about, that we've said, that we've experimented with and evaluated, which are all about passing on the information as a person that if we don't communicate it deliberately, our colleagues are not going to find out. And it can be from simple things like your availability throughout the day. The other day I heard, I can't remember in which podcast, somebody talking about working in the office. Co-working spaces. Working in a co-working space and how someone had developed a way of communicating how available they were. So if they had their headset fully on their ears, it meant do not disturb. If they had the headset around their neck, so off but hanging from their neck, it meant that they were open to interruptions. There was something in the middle, but I can't remember what it was. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you will see a lot of distributed teams and organizations doing, which is they've developed a system of saying, please do not interrupt me unless it's urgent. And actually, today, interrupt me as much as you want because I'm really up for coffee anytime. So that is deliberate communication. And it can go all the way from those simple things to communicating information that you found out about the organization, which you would maybe share in an spontaneous comment to someone when you saw them. Say you're a manager and you've been in your leadership team meeting, something's happened, and you come out and you see a team member and you say, "Oh, that was really interesting. I'm glad I was at that meeting because." In the online space, it could happen that we forget because we don't have that bumping into team member. We don't have that, "Oh, I've just had this and I've seen you. I want to tell you this." So again, having a system, having a habit, a routine through which we bring some of that information back into our team. So all of that is about deliberate communication, which is about the person communicating what others need to know about us to do the work best with us. Work visibility is the second bucket, and that is all about the work. And that can go from full-on work visibility, which might happen in some teams where we work in the open. So instead of working on a document in my computer or in the cloud, but that no one else can see, we might have some documents that are shared and visible to all. So that is the extreme of working out loud and work visibility. For some teams, that will be great. For others, there's no need. And actually, maybe we don't have the psychological safety in the team, or we don't have the habit, or we haven't developed the skill to be able to look at something and know when feedback is required or not. So it's all quite complicated, which is why it's so fascinating. But work visibility can also be about making our workflow visible. So using tools like Trello or Planner or more complicated ones to show what we're working on when and at what stage of completion it is, just so that we all know, because sometimes it's useful to know. Sometimes it's just interesting and makes me feel connected. So there's always lots of levels to this. So we have visible work, like documents, the workflow visibility, and then the visibility of our ideas, of our thoughts, which can come in the shape of photographs, sketches, audio. So again, there's a whole piece, and you just need to know what's useful for you. So work visibility is about the work. I said deliberate communication was about the person. And the final aspect of visible teamwork is planned spontaneity, which is, of course, this thing that we have in the online space, that unless we plan for something to happen, it is not going to happen. So if we want times when we have coffee together, you've got to plan them. If you want to be able to be working on a document and to see if someone else is working on it at the other side of the world or the country or a bit further down the road, and you want to be able to see it, you have to have the tool that allows you to have that. You have to have very deliberately chosen that tool. So again, is what do we need to have in our team? What processes, what routines that allow us to be spontaneous with each other? And this is maybe where the use of the office comes into it. Sometimes that is easier to do there. So we might have to plan to be around each other, or we might want to plan not to tell each other when we're in the office, if that's how that's what we're going to be working with. But we need to decide how we're going to do that. So we've got quite a few episodes covering this concept of visible teamwork, deliberate communication, work visibility, and planned spontaneity. And there's also a couple of episodes, 3, on the link between visible teamwork and motivation and trust and task interdependency. So there's a link between those. So how we use visible teamwork, we can use it, it can affect motivation in a negative and positive way, actually. It can affect trust. And depending on our task interdependency, we might want to use visible teamwork in different ways. So we've got all those episodes. We'll put the links in the show notes. And when I say we, Maya, who's doing the show notes, will put the links. But maybe the best place for you to start is by downloading a PDF that we have for you, which just outlines these principles, talks about asynchronous communication, because this is what we're encouraging now, is that most of these are applied in an asynchronous way, because if not, we just default to meetings. And also we talk a little bit about the leadership behaviors behind it. And you can download this PDF by signing up to our monthly newsletter over at virtualnotdistant.com. So that's the first of the call to actions. Finally, subscribe to this show, 21st Century Work Life, on whatever podcast app you use to make sure we are in your ears for our next episode. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can follow us on Twitter, Virtual Teamwork with a 0 instead of an O. And finally, if you want to get in touch directly with me, Pilar at virtualnotdistant.com. If you want to connect on LinkedIn, tell me you're listening because I don't accept just anyone. There's a lot of people out there and I do like to look after my LinkedIn connections. So Pilar at virtualnotdistant.com for a personal note. Otherwise, all the information about what we do is over at virtualnotdistant.com. Thank you very much for listening. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.